As a boy, on long winter nights, my father shared with me many traditional stories about animals. As a tracker, I have tracked and trailed almost every animal in North America. If there's one thing I've learned, whether it be from the stories or the animals themselves, there is much the Awasak, the animal people, can teach us. Gather round and listen. Yo guano de he yo guano da. Yo guano de he yo guano da. Gayuani he hayokyo he. Gayuani he hayokyo he. Gayuani he hayokyo he. Gayuani he hayokyo he. Yo guano de he yo guano da. Yo guano de he yo guano da. Gayuani he hayokyo he. Gayuani he hayokyo he. Gayuani he hayokyo he. Gayuani he hayokyo he. Yo guano de he yo guano da. This is the story of how Gluskabe changed some of the animals. Long ago, Gluskabe, he gathered all of the Awasak, the animal people, together. You see, Gluskabe knew that soon the Olnumbak, the human beings, would come into the world, and he wanted to make sure that there weren't any animals that would be too dangerous that might kill the Olnumbak. And so, when Gluskabe had gathered all of the animals together, Gluskabe said the word for human beings. He said the word Olnumbak. When Gluskabe said this word, the animals were very scared. Those that could fly flew high into the sky. Those that could swim dove into the waters. Those that could run fast ran as far away as they could. Almost all of the animals ran away. The animals were scared because they knew that the Olnumbak would hunt them. All of them except for two animals. And these two animals were moose and red squirrel. However, moose and red squirrel were much different than they are today. Back then, moose was 5 times the size that moose is today. And red squirrel was 4 times the size of the biggest grizzly bear. And these animals were not scared at all. Instead, they got very angry. And so, Gluskabe, he first walked up to Moose. He looked at Moose, and he said, "Moose, what will you do when you see the first Olnumbak?" Well, Moose said, "When I see the first Olnumbak, I will run through their villages. I will toss them up in the air on my horns, and when they land on the ground, I will stomp them into the earth." Gluskabe thought. The Olnumbak won't last too long with an animal as mean as Moose. I think I must change Moose. And so Gluskabe, with all his great powers, he made himself very big. Bigger than the tallest mountain, much bigger than that giant moose. And when Gluskabe had made himself this big, he simply put out his hand in front of Moose, and he said, "Moose, you are very strong. See if you can move me." Well, Moose stepped forward and put his head up against Gluskabe's hand, and he began to push. He pushed and he pushed, but he could not move Gluskabe. He pushed harder and harder, but instead, the harder Moose pushed, the smaller Moose got. Moose got smaller and smaller and smaller, until Moose was the size Moose is today. And then when Gluskabe lifted away his hand, Moose looked around, and Moose noticed that Moose was much smaller than he was before. And Moose thought, if I bother the human beings, Gluskabe, he might make me even smaller. And as we know, to this day, Moose hardly ever bothers the human beings. But if you look at Moose, and you look at Moose's forehead, you can see a black mark. And we say that is the hand of Gluskabe. And also, if you look at Moose, you notice that Moose's neck is kind of scrunched up, and that's because Moose had pushed so hard. And also, Moose's nose is kind of pushed in a little bit. Well, that was a mistake. You see, Gluskabe, he kind of had his fingers on Moose's nose. And to this day, he kind of feels a little bad about it. Well, the next animal was Red Squirrel. And Gluskabe, he walked up to that Red Squirrel and he said, "Red Squirrel, what will you do when you see the first Oldenbach?" Well, Red Squirrel began to pick up giant trees and boulders and throw them. And Red Squirrel said, "When I see the first human being, I will rip them to pieces. I will tear apart every human being I can find. I will destroy all the human beings on the whole earth." Well, Gluskabe heard this and he thought, this one is even meaner than Moose. I definitely have to change Red Squirrel. And so, Gluskabe, who was still very big, he picked up this giant Red Squirrel in one hand. And when he picked up that giant, fearsome Red Squirrel, he simply began to pet it. He pet that Red Squirrel ever so gently. And as he began to pet that Red Squirrel, it began to get smaller and smaller and smaller, until Red Squirrel was about the size of a bear. But Gluskabe thought, even bear usually runs away when he smells or hears human beings. This one is much too mean. So he went smaller and smaller until Red Squirrel was the size Red Squirrel is today, and Gluskabe simply lifted away his hand. And as soon as he did, that Red Squirrel climbed up to the top of the tallest tree and began yelling down at Gluskabe. And to this day, Red Squirrel still has not lost his hatred for human beings. And if you're ever walking by a tree that a Red Squirrel's in, you'll hear them chattering down at you and throwing acorns and twigs. And you know what they're saying in Red Squirrel language? "I'll tear you apart. I'll tear you apart." Well, lucky for us, those are acorns and twigs and not rocks and boulders. And so it is that Gluskabe changed some of the animals. This is the story of Azban the raccoon and the rock. Long ago, Azban the raccoon was much different than he is today. Long ago, Azban the raccoon, he had very long legs, and he was very fast. Indeed, he was the fastest animal in the whole forest. And Azban liked nothing better than to go around and challenge the other animals to a race. And because he was so fast, he would always win. And another thing Azban loved to do when he was racing and beating all the other animals, he loved to turn around and taunt them. Azban would be racing deer, and he would pass deer, and he would turn around and say, "Ha ha ha, look at you, deer, you are so slow. I, Azban, am so fast." Well, as you can imagine, the animals weren't very happy with this. They also weren't happy because another thing that Azban loved to do is he loved to play tricks on the other animals. And because he was so fast, whenever he played a trick on the animals, they could never catch him. Well, one day, all this would change. One day, long ago, Azban the raccoon, he was running around the land looking for another adventure. Well, as he was running around, he looked up on top of a tall hill. And there on top of that hill, he noticed some kind of creature sitting. Well, being curious, Azban, he figured he'd travel to the top of that hill and see who it was. Maybe it was someone that would like to challenge him to a race. And so Azban, he ran all the way up that hill. And when he made it to the top, he saw that this wasn't a creature at all. It was a great big rock. Well, Azban, he looked at that rock, and he talked to that rock. And as you would address an elder, Azban said, "Grandfather, do you do much traveling? I am Azban, and I travel all over this land." Well, you know something? That rock spoke back. That rock said, "No,
I do not travel. I have sat here for a long, long time.
Well, Azban looked at that rock and said, "Oh, grandfather, that is terrible. You should really try traveling. I have many great adventures in my traveling." The rock just said back again,
I have sat here for a long, long time, and that is how it has always been.
Well, Azban, he looked at that rock and he said, "Nonsense, grandfather. You should try traveling, and I, Azban, will help you." Well, just then, Azban, he got up behind that great big rock on top of that tall hill, and he began to push and push and push on that rock, and that rock slowly began to boonk, 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 waddle back and forth. And so Azban, he pushed as hard as he could, and that rock, kaboom, fell over on its side, and kaboom, 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 began to roll down that hill. Well, Azban, he thought this was great, and he ran and he caught up to that rock that kaboom, kaboom, kaboom was rolling down that hill. He ran next to that rock and he yelled over, "Grandfather, how do you enjoy traveling so far?" And the rock just said, kaboom, kaboom, kaboom. Well, as gravity works, that rock started to pick up some speed. And Azban thought, "Aha! The rock is trying to challenge me to a race. I will show this rock a thing or two." And Azban, he ran as fast as he could. He ran right past that rock that kaboom, kaboom, kaboom was rolling down that hill. He ran past that rock, and then he started to do what he loved to do when he was racing and beating the other animals. He began to zigzag in front of that rock and turn around and taunt it. Azban turned around and said, "Ha! Look at you, grandfather. You are very slow. I, Azban, am very fast. Ha 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 ha." And he continued to zigzag in front of this rock as it kaboom, kaboom, kaboom rolled down that hill. Well, one of those times that Azban turned back to taunt that rock, he wasn't looking where he was going. All of a sudden, he tripped over a stump and, boom, landed right in front of that rock. Well, that rock had never been traveling before, so it didn't know how to stop, and it just kaboom, 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 splat, kaboom, 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 kaboom. Ran Azban over, and then continued on its journey. Well, there lay Azban, very flat and very wide. But he wasn't dead. He was just like this giant raccoon pancake. And all he could move was his lips. He kind of had one eye looking up towards the sky. And this is what he said. "Help me! Somebody please help me!" Well, Azban, he was so flattened out, and so was his voice. His voice was so flat and small that none of the animals could hear his cry for help. Or maybe they did, and they remembered all those tricks he played on them. The birds, they flew overhead, could not hear his cry. Nolka, the deer, walked right by him, could not hear his cry. A madigas, rabbit, boonk, 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 jumped right on top of him, could not hear his cry. Well, Azban, he lay there for almost the entire day, and he thought all was lost. He thought no one would ever save him. But then, towards the end of the day, one of the smallest little creatures was walking by. It was one of the little ant people. That little ant person was just walking along, and it could hear Azban's cry for help. And that little ant person walked right up on top of Azban, looked down at that one eye he had looking up towards the sky, and the little ant person said,
"Azban, how can I help you? Everyone says us ants are good for nothing."
Well, Azban looked up, and he figured this might be the only chance he got. None of the other animals stopped. So Azban looked up and said, "Oh no, you ant people are wonderful with all the things you do. Please help put me back together again, and if you do, I promise I'll always be your friend." Well, that ant person thought about it for a moment. You see, it's not easy being an ant. You're so small that all the other animals seem to just kick you around. And that ant person figured that it would be good to have a friend as big as Azban. And so that ant person went back to the village of the ant people and told all of the other ants that Azban the Great had said that if they helped put him back together again, he would always be their friend. And so all the ant people agreed, and thousands of them. They all traveled together, and they went to that place where Azban lay on the ground, very flat and very wide. And then those ant people, they began to do what ants do so well. They began to work together. And those ant people, they pushed and pulled and pushed and pulled, and they slowly began to shape Azban back together again until he could stand up. Well, when Azban stood up and he realized he could move his arms around, he looked, and those ant people were still clinging to his body. He took one look at them and he went, "Ooh, ants." And he rubbed them off his body, not even saying thank you, and then he began to walk away. However, as Azban started walking away, he soon realized that he was much closer to the earth than he was before. His legs were very short and he was kind of squatty. You see, those ant people, they had not yet finished a job. Although he could move around, they hadn't finished stretching him out. He had wiped them off too early. But Azban, he knew he couldn't go back and ask those ants to finish because he had not fulfilled their promise. And to this day, as we know, Azban the raccoon, he's still that short, squatty raccoon we know. However, if you ever see a raccoon walking through the forest and it hears a sound kind of like rolling thunder, a sound like a big rock making it through the woods, the first thing the raccoon does is climbs the nearest tree it can find because it's always scared that big rock is still coming after it. And another thing, those ant people, although they're very small, they have very big memories, and they have not forgotten how Azban tricked them. And to this day, those ant people are still trying to get back at every raccoon they can find. And you can see this nowadays, especially with all of the highways. If you're ever driving down the road and you see one of those flat raccoons by the side of the road, go see what those ant people are doing now. No longer are they putting raccoons back together. From now on, those ant people, they're taking apart every raccoon they can find. So, it's very important to fulfill your promises, even to the smallest of creatures. This is the story of Bear and Brown Squirrel. Long ago, Bear used to like to walk around and brag about himself. Bear would walk around and say these words, "I am Bear. I am the biggest, I am the strongest animal in the forest. I am Bear. I can do anything." Well, one day long ago, Bear was walking through the forest saying those same words. "I am Bear. I am the biggest, I am the strongest animal in the forest. I am Bear. I can do anything." Well, just then, a small voice spoke out from the top of a tall tree. It said,
"Can you do anything?"
Well, Bear looked up in that tree, and there in the top of that tree was little Brown Squirrel. Bear was insulted that such a small animal would question he, Bear, and Bear looked up in that tree and said, "Yes, I am Bear. I can do anything." Well, that little brown squirrel wasn't going to miss an opportunity, and that little brown squirrel climbed down from that tree and stood in front of Bear. That little brown squirrel looked up at Bear and said,
So you say you can do anything?"
Well, Bear looked down, and Bear was getting even more angry. He looked down at that brown squirrel and said, "Yes, I am Bear. I can do anything." Well, that little brown squirrel looked up and smiled and said,
If you can truly do anything, can you make it so that the sun does not come up?"
Bear thought about it for a moment. That was a pretty big demand, even for Bear. But once again, Bear didn't like being questioned by this little brown squirrel. He looked down at Brown Squirrel and said,
Yes, of course, I can do that. I am Bear. I can do anything.
Then make it so, Brown Squirrel said. Make it so that tomorrow the sun does not come up. Well, just then, the sun was starting to go down for the day. And so Bear walked out into a big field. Bear walked out into that field and looked at that sun that was slowly disappearing behind the horizon. Bear looked at that sun. Bear pointed at the sun and said,
Sun, tomorrow you will not come up. Rrr.
And he growled at the sun. Well, that sun just slowly disappeared behind the horizon, as it always does. And Bear turned back over to Brown Squirrel and said,
You see, the sun is scared of me. It is running away. Tomorrow it will not come up.
Well, little Brown Squirrel just smiled and said,
We shall see.
Now, that night, Bear and Brown Squirrel, they sat next to each other, waiting to see if in the morning the sun would truly come up or not. And as they sat there, they both sang a separate song.
Bear sang this song. The sun will not come up. Rrr. The sun will not come up. Rrr.
Meanwhile, Brown Squirrel sang this song.
The sun is going to rise. Ooh, the sun is going to rise. Ooh, the sun is going to rise. Ooh.
Well, both Bear and Brown Squirrel, they sang their separate songs all night. And when it got close to that time when the sun usually comes up, they sang even louder.
The sun will not come up. Rrr. The sun will not come up. Rrr.
The sun is going to rise. Ooh, the sun is going to rise. Ooh.
Well, just then, guess what happened? The sun came up. And little Brown Squirrel began to laugh at Bear. Little Brown Squirrel said,
Ha 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 ha, I knew you couldn't do everything and anything.
And Bear began to get very, very angry. And Bear looked down at Brown Squirrel and said,
Yes, it's true. The sun did come up. But you won't live to tell anybody about it, 'cause I'm going to eat you.
And Bear, he put his giant paw right on top of that little Brown Squirrel and was just about to scoop him up and eat him in one big gulp. But that Brown Squirrel did some quick thinking. That Brown Squirrel spoke from underneath Bear's hand and said, Oh, Bear, please, just lift your paw for one moment and let me apologize to you and admit you were right, and then you can eat me.
Bear thought about it for a moment. It would be good to have an apology from this silly Brown Squirrel, he thought. I will do that. I will lift my paw up, let him apologize, and then I will eat him.
And so Bear slowly lifted up his paw. But instead of apologizing, that Brown Squirrel ran as fast as he could towards his hole. However, although Brown Squirrel was very fast, bears, even though they're very big, bears are fast too. And Bear took his giant paw and reached right after that Brown Squirrel and was just able to scratch him right down the back. 4 claw marks right down the back of Brown Squirrel. But Brown Squirrel got away with those claw marks, went into his hole, and Bear couldn't dig him out. Now, it was almost winter time, and Brown Squirrel, he had all of his nuts and other food stored for the winter. So he just went down in his hole, curled up, and went to sleep. And Bear, not feeling half as good about himself as he did a moment before, kind of ambled off into the forest, looking for a place where he could sleep as well. It was a long, long winter, and both those animals slept for a long time. And when the springtime came, that little Brown Squirrel came up out of his hole, and he turned around and looked at his back, where those claw marks were. And where those claw marks were on his back, the hair had grown back in black and white stripes, making that brown squirrel the animal that we know today as chipmunk. Now, that chipmunk, when he got up from that long sleep, the sun was just starting to rise for the day. And Chipmunk got up into the top of the tallest tree, and he still does this every morning as the sun rises. Chipmunk got up in the top of that tree and began to sing in chipmunk language to that sun that was rising. And you know what that chipmunk still says to this day?
The sun still comes up. Ooh, the sun still comes up. Who?
And guess who the last animal is up in the morning? Bear. Because Bear is sick of being reminded that even he cannot do everything. This is the story of Azban the raccoon and the crayfish. One day, Azban the raccoon was walking around the land, and it was getting past Azban's lunchtime. So Azban, he was starting to get kind of hungry, and he began looking for something to eat. Well, lucky for Azban, he was near a stream. And if you're a raccoon and you're near a stream, there's always plenty of good things to eat. So Azban, he began to walk down towards this stream, thinking about what he could eat. First, Azban, he thought, maybe I could be lucky enough to catch a big, fat bullfrog. Azban got a little closer to that stream, and he thought, maybe I could be lucky enough to catch a trout under a rock. Azban, he was almost to the edge of that stream, and he thought, maybe, just maybe, I could be lucky enough to catch some crayfish, because more than anything, raccoons love crayfish. Well, as Azban got to the edge of that stream, guess what happened to be sticking its little eyes on stalks out of that water? A little crayfish. Well, that crayfish saw a big, hungry-looking raccoon coming its way, and that crayfish, seeing that raccoon, went up underneath the water and hid underneath a rock, hoping that that raccoon didn't see it. Unfortunately for that crayfish, Azban the raccoon had seen it, and Azban, he began to wade out into that water, and he put his hand on top of that rock that crayfish was hiding underneath. And then he took his other hand with 5 fingers, just like we have, and he began to reach underneath that rock. Now that crayfish, seeing Azban's hand coming under that rock, that crayfish did all that a crayfish person could do. It took one of its sharp claws and pinched the end of Azban's finger. Yow! Azban pulled his hand out of the water. That really hurt. Now Azban, he really wanted to eat that crayfish, but he didn't want to stick his hand back under that rock because he knew he would be pinched again. However, being a trickster, Azban, he thought of an idea that might help trick that crayfish out from underneath that rock, trick that crayfish, and maybe even get more crayfish. Because you know what's better than eating one crayfish? If you're a raccoon, is eating lots of crayfish. And so, this is what Azban did. Azban, he began to grab his stomach and go back and forth, saying, Oh, I'm so hungry. I'm so hungry. I haven't eaten for days. Oh, I'm so hungry. I think I'm starving to death. Oh no, I'm dying. I'm dying. He threw himself up on the shore, stuck his legs up in the air, and said, I'm dead. Now, that little crayfish stuck its eyes out of the water, and it saw that raccoon laying there on the shore, looking very dead. And that crayfish said, Yahoo! I have killed the man-eater. I have killed the great raccoon. I must go tell the chief of the crayfish people. Now that little crayfish scurried along the bottom of that stream as fast as his little crayfish legs could carry him, going to the place where the chief of the crayfish people lived. Meanwhile, Azban, he just laid there on the shore, continuing to play dead. His plan was working. Now, While that little crayfish was traveling along the bottom of that stream, it started thinking of a story that it might be able to tell the chief of the crayfish people. A story that might make it look really good. And so, once that little crayfish made it to the place where the crayfish chief lived, he went up to the chief of the crayfish people, and he said, "My Sagamore, my chief, I have done a great thing. You will be very proud of me." Now the chief of the crayfish people looked at this little crayfish person and said, "What have you done, my friend?" He said, "I have killed the man-eater. I have killed the great raccoon." Now the chief of the crayfish people, he looked at this crayfish person, and he said, "How did you do this?" Well, that crayfish thought for a moment, and he said, "It was a great battle. We fought back and forth, and finally, because I'm so strong, I threw that raccoon high in the air. He landed on his back and died." Now, the chief of the crayfish people, he wasn't quite sure if he believed that story. However, if there really was a dead raccoon along that stream, that would be a very good thing. Because not only do raccoons eat crayfish, but crayfish, they love to eat any dead animals they find along the side of the stream. And if there truly was a dead raccoon, that would be a big meal for the crayfish people. And so, the chief of the crayfish people, he gathered many people from the crayfish village. And they all traveled together along the bottom of that stream, and they went to the place where, sure enough, there lay Azban. Now the chief of the crayfish people, he saw this raccoon laying there, and truly it looked very dead. However, he wasn't quite sure. He wanted to make sure that raccoon was really dead. And so he turned to the crayfish people all gathered behind him, and he asked, "Which one of you is brave enough to see if this raccoon is dead?" Well, one of the little crayfish in the back raised its claw, and the chief looked at him and he said, "Very good, my friend. Go up and out of the water. Go up behind that raccoon laying on the shore, and pinch the end of his tail with your claw. Then we will see if he's dead." And so, this little crayfish person scurried up and out of the water, went up behind Azban laying there on the shore, and pinched the end of his tail. Ooh, this hurt really bad. This hurt Azban so bad that a little tear went down the side of his face. But he didn't move, and he didn't make a sound. And the crayfish person didn't see that tear and went back in the water. Well, the chief of the crayfish people, he was watching, but he still wasn't satisfied. He wanted them to try something else. So he asked, "Which one of you is brave enough to try this next thing?" Well, another little crayfish person raised their claw, and he said, "Very good, my friend. You go up and out of the water. Go up to Azban's face, grab a hold of one of his whiskers, and pull it out." And so, this little crayfish person, like the first little crayfish, scurried up and out of the water, went up to Azban's face, grabbed a hold of one of his whiskers, and pulled it out. Ooh, that hurt even worse than getting his tail pinched. That hurt so bad that both of Azban's eyes watered. But he didn't move, and he didn't make a sound, and like before, the crayfish person didn't see it and went back in the water. Well, wouldn't you know it, the chief of the crayfish people still wasn't satisfied. He wanted them to try just one more thing to make sure that raccoon was really dead. And so he asked, "Which one of you is the bravest of the crayfish people?" Well, then all of the crayfish, they raised their claws. But the chief picked one crayfish out, and that was the crayfish that had told him about the raccoon. And he said, "My friend, you must go up and out of the water. Grab a hold of the end of Azban's nose. Twist it all the way around as hard as you can and pull on it." And so, this little crayfish person scurried up and out of the water, went up to Azban's face, grabbed a hold of the end of his nose, and well, that hurt so bad that not only did both of Azban's eyes water, they both crossed. But even though that hurt worst of all, Azban didn't move, and he didn't make a sound, and the crayfish people didn't see his eyes water or cross. And at that moment, the chief of the crayfish people yelled out, "Yahoo! The man-eater's dead! The man-eater's truly dead! Let us celebrate!" And then all of the crayfish people, they jumped out of the water and they began to dance around Azban. And as they danced, they sang a song. "Yo-ho, the man-eater's dead! Yo-ho, the man-eater's dead! Yahoo, yahoo, yahoo! Yahoo, yahoo, yahoo!" And they danced, and they danced, and they danced. And the whole time Azban, he laid there and continued to play dead, watching those crayfish. Because soon those crayfish, they had danced so hard and so long that their little crayfish legs started to get kind of wobbly, and they started to get kind of out of breath, and they sang, "Yo-ho, the man-eater's dead! Yo-ho, hoo!" And soon all of those little crayfish, they had to take a break. And so they all sat down on their little crayfish behinds, all around Azban. And at that moment, Azban jumped up and said, "Aha! Hum, 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 hum." And he ate all of the crayfish people. So, the next time that a crayfish tells you that it killed a raccoon, are you going to believe it? And another thing they say that no matter how great an enemy is, you should never celebrate in their death. Otherwise, you might end up like those silly crayfish. This is the story of when Turtle went to war with the human beings. One day, Turtle decided that it was time to make war on the human beings. He figured that the human beings, they had been hunting the animals for far too long, and it was time for the animals to fight back. And so Turtle, he took some paint and he put a mark on each one of his cheeks, and then he loaded into his canoe and began to paddle downstream. And as Turtle paddled along, he sang the canoeing song. Kayu wa jine yo he ho he, kayu wa jine, kayu wa jine, kayu wa jine he yo ho, kayu wa jine, kayu wa jine. It wasn't too long before Turtle saw someone standing by the shore, and so he paddled up along shore to take a look. There, on the shore, stood Bear.
"Turtle, I hear you want to make war on the human beings, and I would like to come along."
Well, Turtle took a look at Bear. Bear's foot was almost as big as his whole canoe. He thought about it for a moment, and then he said, "You are too big and clumsy, Bear. The human beings would hear you coming from a mile away, and they would give away our surprise. I'm sorry, Bear, you can't come along." And so Turtle paddled back out into the middle of the stream and began to once again sing his canoeing song. Kayu wa jine yo he ho he, kayu wa jine, kayu wa jine, kayu wa jine he yo ho, kayu wa jine, kayu wa jine. After paddling a little bit further, Turtle saw another animal standing by the shore, and so like before, he pulled up along shore to take a look. This time, it was Wolf.
"Turtle, I hear you want to make war on the human beings. I would like to come along,"
Wolf said. Well, Turtle took one look at Wolf's big mouth with those sharp teeth. Wolf's mouth was even bigger than Turtle. He thought about it for a moment, and then he said, "I am sorry, Wolf. You are much too fast. You would probably just try to run away when the fighting got too tough. I'm sorry, you can't come along." And then Turtle began to paddle once again downstream. Kayuwajine yo he ho he. Kayuwajine, kayuwajine. Kayuwajine he yo ho. Kayuwajine, kayuwajine. Turtle was about halfway to the nearest human village when he saw yet another animal standing by the shore. This animal, he could tell, was much smaller than the others, and so Turtle, he paddled up along shore to take a look. It was Skunk.
Turtle, I hear you are going to make war on the human beings. I would like to come along.
Well, Turtle took a look at Skunk. Skunk was pretty small, and Turtle said, "Huh, what can you do, Skunk? How can you help me declare war on the human beings? You are so small."
I, he said, have a secret weapon.
Huh. Well, you will have to show me this weapon, because I don't really believe you.
Okay, but you won't like it.
Well, just then, Skunk turned around, he lifted his tail, and he sprayed Turtle right in the face.
Oh!
Turtle dove into the water, and he didn't come up for 2 minutes.
Skunk, he said, you can come along. Jump into my canoe.
And so, Turtle and Skunk both paddled downstream, singing the canoeing song. Kayuwajine yo he ho he. Kayuwajine, kayuwajine. Kayuwajine yo he yo ho. Kayuwajine, kayuwajine. Around the next bend, they came to yet another animal standing by the shore. This animal was even smaller than Skunk. And so, Skunk and Turtle paddled up along shore to take a look. It was Rattlesnake.
I hear, you want to declare war on the human beings. I would like to come along.
Rattlesnake, Turtle asked. You are very small. How can you help us go to war with the human beings?
I have a secret weapon.
Turtle thought about it for a split second, and he said, "Jump into the canoe, Snake. You can come along." And so, all three animals paddled downstream, singing the canoeing song. Kayuwajine yo he ho he. Kayuwajine, kayuwajine. Kayuwajine yo he yo ho. Kayuwajine, kayuwajine. After hiding their canoe, Skunk stalked along the shore and hid behind a big bush close to one of the longhouses. Meanwhile, Snake slithered along the ground and made it all the way up to the entrance of another lodge, hiding in a woodpile. At the same time, Turtle hid amongst some pots at the edge of another lodge, pulling in his legs, head, and tail. All three animals hid as quietly as they could, waiting for the morning time when Turtle would let out his war cry. But when the morning time came, Turtle was fast asleep. As the sun began to rise, the woman in the longhouse near the water walked down to the stream to wash her face. But before she made it to the edge of the stream, Skunk lifted his tail and he sprayed the woman. Oh! That really hurt the woman. However, she was very tough, and she picked up a stick and she began to beat Skunk on the top of his head. Well, Skunk did all he could to get away. As Skunk ran away, he gave up all hopes of making war on the human beings. And to this day, Skunk's head is still flattened out from where that woman's stick made its mark. Not too far away, At another longhouse, another woman went out to get some firewood. However, this woman saw a snake hiding there. Picking up a large rock, the woman threw it at Snake, striking him in the head. Well, Snake, too, made his best at getting away. And to this day, Snake also has a flattened out head. And if you ever come up upon a rattlesnake, Rattlesnake will let out a rattle and say, "Tss, I'm not a stick. Tss, I'm not a stick." Despite all this commotion, Turtle was still sound asleep. However, Turtle's sleep would soon be interrupted, as one of the men from that longhouse walked out to pick up a cooking pot. But instead, he picked up Turtle. As soon as Turtle woke up, he let out his war cry, and he grabbed right a hold of that man's leg. "Ah!" the man yelled. Picking up a large stick, the man began to beat Turtle on the back. Each time the man struck Turtle's back, he cracked his shell. But Turtle would not let go. After the man had made many cracks on Turtle's back without him letting go, he began to drag Turtle towards the fire. "I will burn you in the fire, that will make you let go," the man said. Well, Turtle thought about it for a moment, and he said, "Yes, bring me to the fire. Fire will make me stronger." "Then I will drown you in the river," the man said. "No," Turtle said, "not the river. I will drown." And so the man began to walk down towards the river with Turtle still holding on to his leg. But as soon as that man made it into the water, Turtle let go and swam away. As he swam away, Turtle too gave up all hopes of making war on the human beings. However, to this day, if you ever see Turtle sitting on a rock or a log, if you look really close, you can still see the red paint on his cheeks. But Turtle, not wanting to make war on the human beings, will dive into the water as quickly as he can. And another thing, you will never again see a turtle paddling a canoe and singing the canoeing song. Ho, hey.